Chapter 19, American Empire. After the acrimonious social upheavals of the 19th century, America's attention shifted overseas, with a new manifest destiny gripping the nation as the economy improved. This new spirit of American imperialism was a product of a handful of developments. Number one, the experience of subjugating Indian tribes that established a precedent for exerting colonial control over dependent peoples. Two, the closing of the western frontier produced fears that natural resources would soon dwindle. Three, the depression of the 1890s convinced businessmen to look abroad for new economic opportunities. And above all else, Americans were noticing the imperial efforts of European powers to secure foreign lands for their own benefit. And they worried they would miss out on the best markets, colonies, and strategic places for future military bases. Scholars and imperialists justified their expansionism by pointing to Darwin's theories. They contended that nations, like races and like species, struggled for existence, and only the fittest would survive. For strong nations to dominate weak ones then was in accordance with the laws of nature. America now looked abroad. In Hawaii, Americans built a presence to support a greater trade with the Chinese. As early as 1810, Americans brought Christianity, infectious diseases, liquor, firearms, and capitalism to the Polynesian people of the Hawaiian Islands. They bought land, they planted sugar, they imported other Asian workers to work the sugarcane fields and pineapple fields, displacing natives and forever altering the rhythm of daily life in Hawaii. Native Hawaiians did not accept the subjugation without protest, and only with its formal recognition and eventual statehood did the people of Hawaii accept their new American destiny. After he had defeated the populist hero William Jennings Bryan, the conservative Republican William McKinley used his political capital to drum up a conflict with Spain in support of Cuban independence. He belongs in here. William McKinley is going to come up a lot in this chapter. Perez. William McKinley. McKinley protested Spain's uncivilized and inhuman conduct in their battle for Cuba, but it was the destruction of the American battleship Maine, the destruction is the event, that pushed Americans off the sidelines and onto the imperial battlefield. Americans believed that the Spanish had blown it up, and Congress immediately authorized war with Spain, but experts now generally agree that the ship had exploded due to an engine issue. And this is actually a good time to talk about yellow journalism. The media stoked the fires, which we'll get to later. The Secretary of State, John Hay, called the Spanish-American conflict a splendid little war. Certainly an idea. A name which stuck because American soldiers were essentially on mop-up duty by the time they got there. 5,200 American soldiers died from disease, and fewer than 500 died due to battle wounds. Many American soldiers who were sent were not our top forces. Many regiments were black, and both blacks and whites fought alongside black Cuban soldiers. And this experience gave African Americans a stronger case or sense of injustice that they carried back to the South upon their return. American imperialists converted American support for the effort in Cuba to turn away the Spanish into an occasion for acquiring overseas possessions, largely former Spanish colonies, in other places like the Philippines. By an accident of history, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the Cuban Revolution was Teddy Roosevelt. He's already on there, good. He was the one who sent American naval ships to attack the Spanish in the Philippines, which opened the door to expansion into other Spanish colonies. So we see Spain in retreat here. Under armistice, Spain recognized the independence of Cuba, which we wanted, ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States. Remember, these nations, these islands are very close to the American mainland. And they finally accepted American occupation of Manila in the Philippines. Puerto Ricans had fought for decades for rights and independence under Spanish rule. Americans quickly converted the island into an economic colony, awarding them titular citizenship, which exists to this day, and transforming the island into sugar and other cash crop haven for American businesses. The annexation of the Philippines was the first test case for a multifaceted American anti-imperialist movement in the United States. To many in this league, including Carnegie, Mark Twain, controlling a large and densely populated territory thousands of miles away from the U.S. mainland, seemed very different and much more ominous than earlier imperial efforts closer to our shores. Some opposed it on moral grounds. Others feared polluting the American population by incorporating Asian peoples into our nation. Conservatives worried that long-standing armies would only lead to greater international entanglements, and some laborers in the United States feared an influx of cheaper labor from overseas. However, after ruling out his other options, President McKinley, sought to uplift the native population of the Philippines by occupying it, a boon to business interests and pro-imperial forces in America who believed such efforts invigorated the nation's spirit. The imperialists won the day. The Republicans benefited from it. McKinley was reelected in 1900 with the hero of the Spanish-American War, Teddy Roosevelt, as his vice president. Where Hawaii, Alaska, Puerto Rico presented relatively few problems, the Philippine-American War was a U.S. foreign policy quagmire. The conflict in the Philippines is the least remembered, perhaps, of all American wars. It lasted 4 years and involved 200,000 American troops, 1/5 of a million. At least 50,000 Filipinos died in the conflict. American occupiers faced brutal guerrilla tactics from soldiers there and found themselves acting much like the Spanish had in Cuba, returning the brutal favor tactically. Captured Filipino guerrillas were not treated as prisoners of war, but were often executed by American troops. Americans put entire native populations into internment camps in the Philippines. Soldiers came to view the Filipinos they fought as almost subhuman creatures, and some seemed to take pleasure in arbitrarily killing them. By 1902, reports of American atrocities had soured the public on the war. Again, journalism is heading overseas here. By then, though, the war had run its course and Filipinos gradually secured their independence formally in 1946 from the United States. That conflict opened doors into nearby China, which was the goal, which during this era was already being carved up by the English, French, German, Russian, and Japanese powers. Secretary of State John Hay comes up a few times in this chapter. He suggested an open door policy with the nations that claim parts of China. A policy would allow free trade between colonial powers claiming these Chinese territories. It took something of a bizarre Chinese revolt called the Boxer Rebellion to convince the other nations to accept Hay's request, which allowed China to maintain its territorial integrity and kept trade between China and America wide open. The Spanish-American War revealed glaring deficiencies in the American military system. After the war, McKinley appointed a Secretary of War to supervise a major overhaul of the armed forces. The regular army went from 25,000 soldiers to 100,000 soldiers. Officer training schools were instituted and the Joint Chiefs of Staff were established. As a result, the United States entered the 20th century with something resembling a modern military system. As American leaders toyed with a growing empire, foreign policy became much more muscular. According to Theodore or Teddy Roosevelt, a gulf existed between the civilized and uncivilized nations. And as president, he reserved the right to intervene in the affairs of backwards, or mostly non-white nations, for the benefit of what he thought of as both nations. This understanding rested on the popular notion of the white man's burden. That belief, the obligation of civilized Western nations to uplift the uncivilized world, drove Teddy Roosevelt to invest heavily in America's Navy and to put it to use where he saw fit. Roosevelt's Navy helped assert American power in places like Japan and Latin America, to exert pressure on other world powers like Germany and Russia. Convinced that weakness in the Western Hemisphere threatened American interests, Roosevelt announced his Roosevelt Corollary to the earlier Monroe Doctrine. That was previously James Monroe's policy to treat efforts by European nations to colonize land or interfere with states in North or South America as acts of aggression requiring U.S. intervention. Let me say that again. Monroe Doctrine. Anything in the Western Hemisphere is America's sphere. European powers stay out of it. Roosevelt added on to it with his Roosevelt Corollary. He extended Monroe's policy by claiming an American right to intervene in the affairs of those Western Hemisphere nations when they proved unable to manage their own affairs. And he did so in the Dominican Republic, where American power or where America assumed control over economic policy when European creditors came calling for unpaid debts. This is called dollar diplomacy. Here it is. So if the an unstable economic environment would be grounds for American invasion. The most celebrated foreign policy accomplishment of Teddy Roosevelt's presidency was the construction of the Panama Canal, which I have here as an event, which still today links the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. And you can imagine how lucrative, profitable, and smart this was, so that if you wanted to trade, you would not have to go around South or North America. In order to secure more favorable terms than the Colombian Senate would agree to, Roosevelt helped organize and finance a revolution in that part of Colombia. Roosevelt landed American troops from the USS Nashville to maintain order and immediately recognized Panama as an independent nation. The new Panamanian government quickly agreed to favorable terms with the United States, and the Panama Canal was financed and completed. Indeed, Roosevelt talked softly, but carried a big stick. We're going to jump forward in time just a minute and kind of talk about imperialism over the next few presidencies. William Howard Taft, Roosevelt's successor, showed little interest in Roosevelt's imperialism. When Woodrow Wilson assumed the presidency after Taft, however, he faced international challenges of a scope and seriousness unmatched by any president who came before him. In 1915, Wilson sent Marines into Haiti to quell a revolution that killed their president, and American officers even drafted the new Haitian Constitution. Wilson bought the Danish West Indies, the Virgin Islands, when he feared Germany would seize them, and he drafted a deal with Nicaragua to prevent Europeans from building a rival canal in South America. Wilson, a Democrat, differed significantly from his Republican predecessors. Where Taft's government had quietly supported a bloody reactionary coup in Mexico to put in place a pro-American business president, Wilson refused to support the government of butchers that his predecessor had helped put in place. Wilson entertained the idea of supporting constitutionalists like Pancho Villa, but ultimately threw his support to the most powerful group in Mexico City. Pancho Villa considered that a betrayal and crossed the border into New Mexico and killed 17 Americans in retaliation. Wilson ordered General John J. Pershing into Mexico to find Pancho Villa, but all they did was push both nations to the brink of war, and Villa was never found. Debates over American imperialism throughout these decades revolved around more than just politics and economics and national self-interest. They also included notions of humanitarianism, morality, religion, and the idea of what civilization itself meant. And they included a significant participation by American women. Indeed, when commentators such as Teddy Roosevelt gave speeches about America's overseas ventures, they generally sounded like this was something masculine only. It was the work of soldiers, sailors, government officials, bureaucrats, explorers, businessmen. But in fact, U.S. imperialism focused on economic and cultural influence, even more so sometimes than military and political power. And this offered a range of opportunities for white middle-class Christian women to participate. In addition to working as representatives of American business, women could serve as missionaries, teachers, medical professionals, and as artists and writers. They were inspired by and helped transmit ideas about imperialism to the public. For example, as a spokesman for the Heinz Corporation, Margaret McLeod, where is she right here? Margaret McLeod, projected an image of middle-class American domesticity, of pure womanhood. Heinz saw itself not only as purveying economical and healthful foods, it was bringing the blessings of civilization to the world by harnessing the power of American femininity to sell its products abroad. For Americans at the turn of the 20th century, imperialism and immigration were two sides of the same coin. The involvement of American women with imperialist and anti-imperialist activity demonstrates how foreign policy concerns were brought home and became, in a sense, domesticated. There's also no coincidence that many of the women involved in both imperialist and anti-imperialist organizations were also concerned with the plight of new arrivals to the United States. Industrialization, imperialism, and immigration were all linked. Imperialism had at its core a desire for markets for American goods, and those goods were often increasingly manufactured by immigrant labor domestically. The sense of growing dependence on others as producers and consumers, along with doubts about their capability of assimilation into the mainstream of white Protestant American society, caused a great deal of anxiety among native-born populations. Between 1870 and 1920, over 25 million immigrants arrived in the United States. This migration was largely a continuation of a process that had begun before the Civil War. though by the turn of the 20th century, new groups such as Italians, Poles, Eastern European Jews, they made up a larger percentage of the arrivals, while Irish and German numbers began to dwindle. Catholics went from just 1% of the population to a plurality in the span of just a few decades, raising concerns about religious incompatibility with their divided allegiance supposedly between Rome and Washington. I said a lot just a second ago, and I wanted to actually write these terms out for you so we have, and I'll give you an example. Industrialization, bear with me, immigration, and imperialism. I'm not supposed to write where my face is, but that's okay. How are these ideas linked, and what was I just talking about very quickly? When you have massive groups of immigrants coming into the country and you are increasingly going abroad to get products and sell products, and those products are being produced at a rapid rate, America went from a sort of an insular country, if you can imagine, had immigrants coming in. But as soon as we went abroad, the pattern of what it meant to be an American was changing rapidly with so many immigrants coming in, which is really good for industrialization. But imperialism meant that the people making American products were selling them to people who weren't even Americans anymore. So what did it really mean to be an American if overwhelmingly we went from a Protestant country to a Catholic country in just a few decades because we let so many people in the door? And so what we're going to see here, especially as we finish this chapter and get into the next chapter, is finally sort of an effort to deal with some of these perceived problems. There's a willingness to sort of harness the power of government to deal with some of this in both positive and very negative ways, I would argue. And so this is America at an identity crisis here. That's where we're at. Progressives were very divided over how to handle the problems of immigration in America. Many sought to uplift and help those immigrants adapt to American culture, while others argued that an easier solution would be to simply limit the number of immigrants allowed into the country to reclaim that American identity. In the first decades of the 20th century, scholars supported the gate closers. Scientific theories suggested immigrants were polluting the nation's racial stock, a theory closely affiliated with the idea of eugenics, which spread the false belief that human inequalities were hereditary and that immigration was contributing to the multiplication of the unfit. As a result, nativist politicians began to limit immigration by specific nationality, most starkly with Chinese and Japanese immigrants in response to their economic successes in the New World. Even as many people rejected these racist and racial arguments, truly racist, limiting immigration, which World War I effectively did anyway, did relieve some of the problems of overcrowding, unemployment, strained social services, social unrest. Efforts to limit immigration were supported by people like Teddy Roosevelt. With the shift toward limiting immigration, new and multifaceted movements toward real social policy reform were just now beginning in the United States.